In September of 2023, a private philology group out of Leipzig quietly published a translation the archaeological establishment refused to touch. The tablet was small, barely the size of a man's hand. Catalogued in 1934, filed under a generic Old Babylonian designation, left in a storage drawer for 89 years, because the surface script was considered damaged beyond recovery. When the new spectral imaging finally lifted the wear away, what emerged was not a hymn, not a receipt, not a boundary marker. It was something else. Something the Leipzig team, in their internal notes, began referring to as the garden document. And once you understand what the garden document actually says, you cannot look at the story of Eden the same way again. Because according to the tablet, the garden was not a paradise. The garden was a facility, and the humans placed inside it were not the point of the experiment. They were the prototype. And the tablet describes, in 11 separate passages, what was grown afterward. The clay itself is unremarkable. Standard Mesopotamian river silt, fired at a moderate temperature, roughly 4.5 inches across, thickness consistent with the second millennium before the Common Era. The scribal hand is careful, small, precise, the kind of work associated with temple archivists rather than commercial record keepers. The dialect is transitional, sitting between late Sumerian and early Akkadian, which places composition somewhere in the neighborhood of 1900 to 1700 years before the Common Era. Nothing about the physical object screamed for attention. The reason it sat in a drawer for nearly a century was simple. The upper third of the tablet had been deliberately abraded. Someone, at some point in antiquity, had taken a stone and worn the surface down until the signs became unreadable to the naked eye. The lower two-thirds were legible but fragmentary, and early translators in the 1930s concluded the piece was too damaged to be worth serious effort. It was shelved. Storage held it through the war, through the reorganization of the museum, through 2 changes of curatorial staff, through the digitization initiatives of the early 2000s. Nothing changed until a graduate student running reflectance transformation imaging on unrelated inventory noticed that the abraded section was not blank. There were signs under the damage. Deep signs. Someone had cut them into the clay before firing, and then someone else had tried to erase them after. That distinction matters, because the signs that were hidden were not the same as the signs left visible. The visible portion of the tablet is a fairly conventional account of the creation of the first humans by the Anunnaki, consistent with material already known from Atrahasis and other Old Babylonian sources. The hidden portion, the part someone in antiquity had gone to considerable trouble to obscure, is the 11 passages. And the 11 passages are not a creation story. They are a status report. The first passage describes what the tablet calls the garden. In the surface text, the garden is the place where the first humans were formed and placed. In the hidden text, the garden is described in language that translators struggled to render, because the terms used are technical rather than mythic. The word rendered as garden carries a secondary sense of enclosure, a bounded space with controlled conditions. The word rendered as tree carries a secondary sense of vessel, or generator, something that produces rather than something that grows. And the phrase rendered as walking with, the phrase used to describe the gods moving through the garden, carries a secondary sense of inspection. Not communion, inspection. The hidden text is not describing a paradise. It is describing a facility, and it is describing beings who came to that facility periodically to check on what was inside. The tablet lists what was inside. There were the humans, referred to by the standard Anunnaki term for their crafted workers. There were the plants that produced, and the tablet is specific that these plants did not grow the way ordinary plants grow. They were spoken to, and they responded. There were the animals that watched, described with a word that indicates a creature aware of being observed. Quick pause, and this is something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there's a second document. It's called the 7 resets. Every time the world was erased, matched against the garden tablet sequence, and the checklist of signs for the 8th, 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. That's all. Back to the video. And there was something the tablet calls the still one, kept in the center of the garden, which the humans were forbidden to approach. What the still one was, the passage does not say. But the phrasing suggests it was not a thing. It was someone. The second passage is where the tablet stops describing what was in the garden and starts describing what happened when the garden ended. Because the garden did end, the tablet is unambiguous about this. There is a phrase that translators rendered as the closing of the enclosure, and it refers to a specific event. The Anunnaki, according to the hidden text, decided the garden had produced what it was going to produce, and they moved on. The humans were pushed out, which the surface layer of Mesopotamian myth remembered as the expulsion, and which later Semitic tradition remembered as the fall. But the tablet's version is different. The humans were not punished, they were released. Released the way you release an experimental line when it has yielded its data, and you no longer need to maintain it under controlled conditions. The word the tablet uses for this release carries the sense of setting free, but also the sense of no longer required. And that is important, because the humans were the first thing produced in the garden, and everything else that comes in the tablet is produced afterward. Which means the story of Eden is not the story of humanity's origin, it is the story of the first draft. The third passage introduces the second thing. The tablet calls it, literally, the one that came after. Translators debated for months whether this should be understood as a single organism, a species, or a category. The consensus that emerged is that it refers to a designed being, distinct from the human line, produced by the Anunnaki in a second phase of the garden work after the humans were released. The tablet describes the one that came after in physical terms. Taller than the humans, longer limbs, a different skull shape, described with a word that suggests elongation from front to back rather than the human proportion. And it describes cognitive differences. The one that came after did not sleep the way humans sleep. It did not require the same nourishment. It communicated in a manner the tablet renders as speaking without sound, which the Leipzig team read as a reference to non-vocal signaling of some kind. And crucially, the one that came after did not last. The tablet says it was produced, observed, and then, in the phrase used, folded back. Not killed, folded back. As if it were returned to whatever process had produced it. The fourth passage introduces the third. And this is where the tablet begins to feel less like archaeology and more like a laboratory notebook, because the third thing is described in even more specific terms. Smaller than the humans. Gray in surface color, which is a word Mesopotamian scribes almost never applied to living things. Large ocular structures, again described with technical rather than mythic vocabulary. And a lifespan the tablet renders as brief compared to the workers. The workers meaning the humans, and this third thing, the tablet says, was made in numbers. Not one, not a pair. Many. The tablet uses a numerical quantifier that translators rendered as multitudes, and it specifies that they were distributed. Where they were distributed, the passage does not say. But it says the Anunnaki placed them, and then it moves on, which suggests the placing was ongoing at the time the tablet was inscribed. The fifth passage introduces the fourth thing. And this one, more than any of the others, is what convinced the Leipzig team that they were not reading a myth. Because the fourth thing is described as a hybrid, a combination. The tablet uses a compound sign, cutting together two glyphs that ordinarily do not appear together in Mesopotamian writing, and the compound sign appears to indicate a merger of the human line with something else. What that something else is, the tablet does not fully specify. There is a reference to that which watches from above, which could be understood as celestial or could be understood more literally as a category of Anunnaki being. And there is a reference to that which listens through the ground, which no one has been able to interpret confidently. But the merger is clear. The tablet describes a being that has the shape of a human, more or less, but does not have the internal life of a human. It has something else. And the tablet says this fourth thing was distributed as well. It says the fourth thing was placed among the workers, among the humans, meaning that at the moment the tablet was written, according to the tablet's own claim, there were already beings walking among the human population that were not human. That claim, on its own, would be enough to explain why someone in antiquity took a stone and tried to erase this tablet. But the tablet does not stop there. It continues. And the sixth passage, which is where the hidden section reaches its densest point, describes the process by which these successor organisms were made. The tablet uses vocabulary that translators found deeply unsettling because the vocabulary is not mythic, it is procedural. There is a word rendered as the taking of the essence, and it refers to the extraction of something from the original human line, the workers. Another word is rendered as the mixing chamber, and it refers to a physical location where combinations were prepared. A third phrase is rendered as the counting of the runs, which refers to iteration, and which specifies that many combinations were tried before the ones that survived were selected. The tablet does not describe this as magic, it describes it as work. The kind of work that requires patience, records, failed attempts, and a clear understanding of what is being aimed at. And what was being aimed at, the tablet says, was something the humans could not have understood if they had been shown it. Because the humans were not built to understand it. The humans were built for something else. The humans were the substrate. That word, substrate, is the Leipzig team's rendering of a Sumerian compound that literally reads as the ground for growing on. It appears 3 times in the hidden section, and each time it refers to the human population, not to individual humans, to the population as a whole. Stated with the flatness of an inventory entry, the tablet's claim is that the humans were the biological medium in which the successor organisms were cultivated. Humans provided the essence, the environmental conditions, and, over generations, the raw material from which the later designs were drawn. Eden was not the beginning of humanity. Instead, the garden was the moment humanity was seeded into a longer process, and the passages that follow describe what that longer process produced. Passage after passage, in the same clean hand, the tablet catalogs organisms built from a foundation that was, at some earlier point, walking upright in a controlled garden, unaware it was raw material for something the workers themselves were never meant to see and never meant to become. Before we move to the successor species, stop. What you heard about the Garden Lab only makes sense on the full timeline, next to the 6 resets before it. Everyone ended with a new organism. Everyone failed. It's in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it. Come back. What's next builds on it. QR code on screen. The 7th passage introduces the 5th thing, and this is where the tablet's tone changes. Up to this point, the hidden text has been descriptive, cataloging what was made and how. Starting with the 5th thing, the tone shifts toward warning. The 5th thing is described as the one that hides, and the vocabulary used to describe it is vocabulary of camouflage, of concealment, of taking on the appearance of what surrounds it. The tablet says the 5th thing was made to move without being seen. It says the 5th thing does not have a fixed form. And it says that among the humans, the 5th thing walks unrecognized, which is not a claim ancient scribes made lightly. This is not the language of demon or spirit, both of which have their own specific vocabulary in Mesopotamian scribal tradition. This is the language of a made organism designed for a specific purpose, and the purpose was to blend in. The tablet does not say why. It only says that the 5th thing was made, that it was released, and that it is still here. That last phrase, still here, is one of the most contested renderings in the whole document. The verb form is present continuous. It refers to the moment of the tablet's writing, 4,000 years ago. But the phrasing implies a persistence beyond that moment, as if the scribe were describing a condition that had not ended. The 8th passage introduces the 6th thing, and this one is described in language so specific that some members of the Leipzig team quietly refuse to work on it further. Understand first that the 6th thing is not a body. It is described as an intention, or a pattern, that lives inside bodies. According to the tablet, the 6th thing was made when the Anunnaki grew tired of building new organisms, and instead began modifying the ones already present. The word used for this modification carries the sense of teaching, but also the sense of writing on. Once written, the 6th thing entered a certain fraction of the human population, and those into whom it was written did not know it had been done. They lived their lives, they had children, and the 6th thing passed with them, and continued. The tablet says the 6th thing is a way of thinking, not a body, and it says the way of thinking, once installed, is inherited. The 9th passage introduces the 7th thing, and this passage is the shortest in the hidden section. It is only 3 lines. The tablet says the 7th thing was made at the end, when the Anunnaki were preparing to leave. It says the 7th thing was not a creature and not a pattern. The 7th thing was a caretaker, something left behind to watch the others, to make sure the previous 6 things continued to do what they were designed to do. The passage does not describe the caretaker's form. It says only that it is quiet, that it does not age, and that it can be found where the ground is broken open, which is a phrase that Mesopotamian scribes typically used in reference to ruined cities, or excavated pits, or places where the older layers of the world had been exposed. The Leipzig team spent a long time on that line. The consensus rendering is that the 7th thing is present at sites of disturbance, places where something has been uncovered. The 10th passage steps back from the individual organisms and speaks about the sequence as a whole. It says, the 7 things were made in order, each one drawing on the previous, each one representing a refinement of the goal. What the goal was, the passage does not state directly, but it uses a phrase, repeated 3 times, that translators rendered as the completion of the shape. The shape being completed is not described. It is not any of the 7 organisms individually. It is something the 7 organisms together were meant to bring into being. The tablet suggests that the 7 were stages, that each successor was closer to what the Anunnaki actually wanted than the one before it, and that when the 7th was released, the Anunnaki considered their work in the garden complete. Not because they had produced the final thing, but because they had produced enough of the components that the final thing could now assemble itself. That is the claim that changes what the tablet means. Because if the Anunnaki did not finish the process, if they only laid the groundwork and left, then the process is still running. The tablet does not describe an ancient event, it describes an ongoing one. And the 11th passage confirms this reading. The 11th passage is the last passage in the hidden section, and it is the longest. It is a summary, restating the 7 organisms in order, restating their purposes, and then it says something that no one in the Leipzig team wanted to be the first to translate out loud. It says that when the shape is complete, the humans will not be needed. The word used for not needed is the same word used earlier for released, the word applied to the humans at the end of the garden. The tablet uses the language of routine housekeeping. When the shape is complete, the substrate is released. Just the way you release a cell culture when the tissue you were growing has finished forming. Just the way you clear a petri dish. Humans, according to the tablet's own logic, were the medium, and when the medium is no longer required, the medium is discarded, not out of malice, out of procedure. The 11th passage does not say when this will happen, but it does say what will precede it. It lists 3 markers, 3 conditions that will be present when the shape is nearing completion. The first marker is that the successor organisms will be recognized. The tablet does not say by whom. It says only that there will come a time when the humans become aware that they are not alone in their own species, that other things walk among them, and that these other things are not accidents of birth or illness, but deliberate. The second marker is that the caretaker will show itself. That 7th thing, the one that watches from sites of disturbance, will move where it can be seen. According to the tablet, this openness is not a mistake. It is a sign that the process no longer requires concealment, because the process is too far along to be stopped. The third marker is that the humans will begin to describe the process themselves, without knowing why, without knowing what they are describing. The tablet says the humans will begin telling stories, making pictures, dreaming things that match the truth of what has been done to them. The tablet says this is inevitable, because the pattern of the 6th thing, once written into the population, eventually surfaces in the population's own thoughts. And when enough humans begin to describe the process is nearly finished. The Leipzig team published the translation quietly, not because they were suppressed, because they were unsure what they had. The tablet is either a very elaborate literary composition from the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, using vocabulary and structure that has no known parallel in surviving Mesopotamian material, or it is what it says it is. A status report left in a temple archive, describing what was made and what was still to come. Both possibilities are unsettling in different ways. The first possibility means an anonymous scribe, working 4,000 years ago, invented from nothing a coherent framework of designed organisms, procedural genetics, generational modification, and a completion process leading to the removal of the source population. The second possibility means that framework is real, that the garden was a facility, that the humans were the substrate, and that the 7 things the tablet catalogs have been walking, hiding, watching, and completing themselves for 4,000 years, while the humans went about their days unaware. There are people who will say the tablet is a forgery. There is no evidence for that claim. The clay is period appropriate. Scribal hand matches other verified pieces from the same region. Abrasion pattern shows wear consistent with deliberate suppression in antiquity, not modern tampering. There are people who will say the translation is wrong. That is possible. Translation of Old Babylonian material always involves interpretive choices. But the Leipzig team's rendering has now been reviewed by 4 independent philologists, and while they disagree on details, none of them has proposed a reading that fundamentally changes the 11 passages. The garden was described as a facility. Humans were described as the substrate. 7 successor organisms were described as made, released, and continuing. 3 markers were described as the signs that would appear before the shape was complete. Those are not translator inventions. Those are the words on the tablet, which leaves the question of what to do with it, because if you read the tablet as literature, you can shelve it and go on with your life. If you read the tablet as record, the 3 markers become a checklist. And the first marker, the recognition of the successor organisms, The awareness that other things walk among the human population has been the subject of increasing public discussion for decades now, under different names, under different frameworks, sometimes called by one word, sometimes another, but the substance of the claim that there are beings present who look human and are not has moved steadily from fringe to mainstream in ways that would be difficult to explain if the underlying reality did not, at some level, exist. The second marker, the caretaker showing itself at sites of disturbance, is harder to assess. But the tablet is specific that the caretaker is found where the ground is broken open. And in the last 30 years, the number of excavations, mines, deep drilling projects, and archaeological digs that have reported anomalous encounters has grown to the point that the pattern is visible to anyone willing to look at it honestly. The third marker, the humans describing the process without knowing what they are describing, is the one you are participating in right now. Every book, every documentary, every whispered conversation about ancient astronauts, about the garden, about hidden bloodlines, about the beings that came before and the beings that came after, is the tablet's third marker, unfolding on schedule. According to the tablet, the pattern rises in the population as the shape nears completion. According to the tablet, the fact that you are watching this video is itself a data point. None of this is a claim that the tablet is true. It is a claim that the tablet exists, that its words say what they say, and that the words describe a process that, when tested against the observable state of the world, does not immediately fall apart. Whether it should fall apart, whether it will fall apart under further scrutiny, whether the Leipzig team's rendering will hold up over the next decade of review, none of that is settled. What is settled is the tablet itself. A small piece of clay, half erased in antiquity, sitting in a museum drawer for 89 years, waiting for someone to see under the damage. And what someone finally saw was a document that treats the garden not as beginning, but as first draft. That treats humanity not as endpoint, but as prototype. And that catalogs, in the language of a working inventory, what was grown in the same soil after we were released to make room for it. The tablet does not tell you what to believe. It only tells you what it says. What you do with that, 4,000 years after it was written and just 1 year after it was finally read aloud, is, from this point on, your problem to carry.